In March 2012, the body of 44-year-old Reverend Nathaniel Cross was discovered in his luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park in New York City. An investigation uncovered the shocking details of his tumultuous relationship with socialite Evelyn Monroe. In August 2011, at Divine Grace Ministries located in Manhattan, a series of events began that would ultimately spiral into betrayal, obsession, and murder. On the morning of March 6, 2012, the city of New York was waking up to its usual hustle and bustle. The streets outside were alive with the sounds of honking taxis and hurried footsteps as the city prepared for another day. Inside Reverend Nathaniel Cross's luxurious penthouse, however, a stark silence loomed. His housekeeper, Maria Gonzalez, had arrived promptly at 7 a.m., as she always did on Tuesday mornings. The tall glass building overlooking Central Park glistened in the early sunlight, its grandeur masking the horrors waiting inside. Maria, a meticulous woman in her mid-50s known for her loyalty and attention to detail, had worked for Nathaniel for years, maintaining his immaculate home and ensuring his personal needs were met. She knew the penthouse well, every creak in the floor, every misplaced item, every scent lingering in the air. But that morning, something felt different. The moment she stepped off the elevator and into the quiet corridor leading to the penthouse door, she sensed it. The door was locked, as it should have been, but the silence behind it felt unsettling. Maria entered the code to unlock the door and pushed it open. Inside, the usual warmth of the apartment was replaced by a chilling stillness. The living room, typically filled with light and life, was bathed in an eerie glow from the rising sun filtering through the sheer curtains. Maria set down her bag and called out, "Reverend," her voice carrying through the spacious rooms. There was no answer. As she moved deeper into the apartment, a faint metallic smell caught her attention. It was a smell she couldn't immediately place, but it unsettled her. She glanced around the living room and kitchen, noting that nothing seemed out of place, the wine glasses on the counter, a few stray papers on the coffee table. It all looked normal, but the smell was growing stronger. As she approached the hallway leading to the master bedroom, Maria hesitated. The double doors to the bedroom were slightly ajar, which was unusual. The Reverend was a private man who rarely left his personal space so exposed. She pushed the doors open further and immediately froze. The sight before her was beyond anything she could have imagined. Reverend Nathaniel Cross lay sprawled on the Persian rug, his once commanding presence reduced to a lifeless figure. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the intricate patterns of the rug, its deep red contrasting sharply with the cream and gold design. His body bore multiple stab wounds, each one a testament to the violence of the attack. His face, so often a picture of calm authority, was contorted in an expression of sheer terror. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Maria's hands flew to her mouth as she stifled a scream. Her knees buckled, but she forced herself to remain standing. Panic surged through her as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The metallic smell now overwhelmed her, mixing with the sickening reality of what lay before her. She reached for her phone with trembling hands and dialed 911, her voice barely steady as she relayed what she had found. While waiting for the authorities, Maria noticed details she wished she could unsee. A single high-heeled shoe lay partially hidden under the edge of the bed, its sleek black leather catching the light. On the nightstand, an empty wine glass sat next to an open Bible, the contrast between the sacred and the profane adding to the surrealness of the scene. The room itself showed no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken items. It was as if the attack had been swift, precise, and deeply personal. By 7:30 a.m., the first responders arrived. The flashing lights of police cars and ambulances illuminated the otherwise serene street below. Detective Alan Carter, a seasoned investigator with the NYPD, was among the first to enter the scene. He was immediately struck by the juxtaposition of luxury and violence. The penthouse, with its crystal chandeliers and custom artwork, now bore the marks of a brutal crime. The detectives moved methodically, documenting every detail. The high-heeled shoe was carefully bagged as evidence, its presence raising questions about who had been in the apartment the night before. The wine glass was dusted for fingerprints, and photographs were taken of the blood patterns on the rug and walls. Forensic experts speculated that the multiple stab wounds suggested a crime of passion, the sheer ferocity of the attack indicating deep anger or desperation. By the time the body was removed, the penthouse had become a grim puzzle for the investigators. Initial interviews with neighbors revealed little. Most had been asleep or out of the building, and no one reported hearing anything unusual. However, security footage from the lobby and elevators showed that someone had entered the building late the previous night, a woman dressed in a dark coat, carrying a bag. Her face was obscured by a scarf, but her movements suggested she was familiar with the building. As the investigation unfolded, the story began to spread. By March 8, news outlets were flooded with reports of the shocking murder. Details of Reverend Cross's life and his connections to high society figures, including Evelyn Monroe, emerged. Evelyn, known for her glamorous appearances at charity events, became a person of interest. Her complicated marriage to Richard Monroe, a prominent attorney, added yet another layer of intrigue to the case. Her close relationship with Nathaniel hinted at a scandal far deeper than anyone had anticipated. The stage was set for one of New York's most sensational cases, but the full truth was still hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. In the glittering world of Manhattan's elite, Evelyn Monroe seemed to live a life most could only dream of. Her days were filled with elegance that inspired envy, lunches at the finest restaurants, exclusive charity galas, and afternoons spent in the opulence of her country club. To the outside world, Evelyn was the picture of success, a stunning woman in her early 40s married to the prestigious and powerful defense attorney Richard Monroe. Together, they were a fixture in high society, their names whispered with admiration at every social gathering. But beneath the surface, Evelyn's life was a hollow shell, fragile and empty. Her marriage, once passionate and filled with promise, had grown cold over the years. Richard, now more engrossed in his high-profile cases and flirtations with younger associates, treated Evelyn like a part of the decor, beautiful but unnoticed. Her once vibrant energy dulled as she spent her evenings alone in their sprawling penthouse, staring at the clock and wondering when Richard might come home, if at all. The laughter and intimacy they once shared had been replaced by distant silences and polite indifference.
By the time 2011 arrived, Evelyn's loneliness had reached unbearable heights. It was during one of these lonely stretches that she first attended Divine Grace Ministries, a massive megachurch that had recently captured the attention of New York's elite. The church, housed in a gleaming modern building, was unlike anything Evelyn had ever seen. The sermons were not only spiritual but dazzling, filled with charisma, theatrics, and music that echoed through its vaulted ceilings. At the center of it all was the pastor, Reverend Nathaniel Cross. Nathaniel was a man who commanded the room effortlessly. His deep, resonant voice seemed to wrap itself around his congregation, offering comfort, guidance, and a sense of purpose. At 44 years old, he was the epitome of charm and magnetism, with his sharp-tailored suits and the faint scent of expensive cologne. To Evelyn, he was more than just a preacher, he was a lifeline. A man who made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. Their connection began innocently enough. Evelyn started attending services regularly, drawn not only by Nathaniel's sermons but by the way he seemed to look directly at her during them. It wasn't long before she sought private counseling sessions, a service Nathaniel often offered to his wealthier congregants. These meetings became a sanctuary for Evelyn, a place where she could pour out her frustrations about her marriage and her loneliness without judgment. Nathaniel listened intently, his soothing presence and wise words giving her a glimmer of hope. By late summer, the nature of their relationship began to shift. What had started as spiritual guidance transformed into something far more personal. Evelyn, desperate for affection and validation, found herself falling deeply for the charismatic pastor. Nathaniel, always attuned to the vulnerabilities of those around him, reciprocated, though his reasons were far less pure. For him, Evelyn represented status, wealth, and influence. A powerful combination he had grown accustomed to exploiting. Their affair was intoxicating for Evelyn, but it was also dangerous. She began showering Nathaniel with extravagant gifts, a Rolex watch for his birthday, bespoke suits tailored to his frame, and a donation to the church that dwarfed all others. Her generosity didn't go unnoticed within the congregation. fueling whispers among the staff and members. Still, Evelyn was blind to the growing scrutiny. In Nathaniel, she saw not just a lover but a chance to escape her loveless marriage, a man who made her feel alive again. By early 2012, cracks in their arrangement began to appear. Nathaniel, ever mindful of his public image, started to pull away. Rumors of the affair had begun to circulate, and he feared that continued involvement with Evelyn could jeopardize his position. He began canceling their meetings and avoiding her calls, offering vague excuses about being busy. For Evelyn, this withdrawal was devastating. She felt betrayed, abandoned by the one person who had given her hope. Her once infatuated love turned into something darker, an obsession fueled by jealousy and desperation. Evelyn's attempts to reconnect became more frantic. She sent him messages at all hours, her words swinging between pleas for reconciliation and veiled threats of exposure. She visited his office unannounced, confronting him in heated exchanges that left Nathaniel visibly shaken. Those around the pastor began to notice his unease, though he kept the details of their encounters private. On the evening of March 5, 2012, Evelyn made a final, fateful decision. She arrived at Nathaniel's building carrying a bottle of expensive wine, her intentions unclear even to herself. Security footage later revealed her entering the lobby just after 9:30 p.m. Her movements purposeful yet tense. Upstairs, Nathaniel reluctantly let her into his penthouse, perhaps in an attempt to placate her one last time. Neighbors later reported hearing muffled voices coming from Nathaniel's apartment, the tone escalating as the night wore on. By 11 p.m., the sounds turned violent, a crash followed by the unmistakable shattering of glass. In the quiet that followed, no one thought to call the authorities, assuming it was merely a lover's quarrel that had resolved itself. What happened next was pieced together by investigators in the days that followed. Evelyn, overcome by rage and rejection, had turned their argument into a deadly confrontation. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen, the cold steel glinting under the light, and unleashed her fury. Nathaniel, unprepared for the ferocity of the attack, succumbed to over a dozen stab wounds, each one a manifestation of the turmoil Evelyn had carried for months. After the deed was done, Evelyn stood in the chaos she had created. The once pristine apartment was now a blood-streaked scene of horror. She wiped her fingerprints from the knife and hurriedly tried to clean any trace of her presence. But in her haste, she overlooked crucial details: the single high-heeled shoe she left behind, the wine glass with her lipstick print, and the faint smear of blood on the doorknob. As she fled the scene, the city outside remained oblivious, while Evelyn disappeared into the night, leaving behind a story of passion, betrayal, and violence that would soon grip the world. By March 8, 2012, the air in the precinct was thick with tension. Detectives working the case of Reverend Nathaniel Cross's murder had spent days sifting through evidence, piecing together the events that led to his violent death. The discovery of a single high-heeled shoe, an empty wine glass, and the chilling footage of a woman entering his building the night of the murder had drawn their focus to a single suspect, Evelyn Monroe. Her name had come up repeatedly during interviews with church staff and congregation members. She was known not only for her striking beauty and wealth but also for her unusually close relationship with the Reverend. That morning, Evelyn was brought in for questioning. She arrived at the station dressed impeccably, her tailored coat and subtle makeup projecting the image of composure. But her eyes betrayed her. They darted nervously around the room as the detectives led her into the interrogation room, a stark contrast to her usually confident demeanor. To anyone watching, It was clear she was a woman unraveling beneath the weight of mounting suspicions. During the interrogation, Evelyn initially maintained her innocence, claiming she had spent the evening of March 5 at home alone, reading and preparing for an upcoming charity event. Her story, though detailed, felt rehearsed. And it didn't take long for the detectives to begin picking it apart. They pressed her on the inconsistencies in her timeline, questioning why she had been unresponsive to calls and messages during the time of the murder. Evelyn's voice grew shakier with each question, her responses becoming more defensive. The breakthrough came when detectives presented her with the surveillance footage from Nathaniel's building. The grainy video showed a woman matching Evelyn's description entering the lobby shortly after 9:30 p.m., carrying what appeared to be a bottle of wine. The timestamp was undeniable. Confronted with this evidence, Evelyn faltered. She stammered explanations that shifted with each retelling. She had dropped off the wine as a donation for the church. She had merely wanted to check on Nathaniel. And later she claimed she couldn't recall being there at all. The detectives watched as her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. By the time the interrogation ended, Evelyn had unwittingly given the detectives enough to deepen their suspicions. They released her that evening but kept her under close surveillance, knowing it was only a matter of time before the evidence caught up to her. A week later, on March 15, a routine traffic stop by a patrol officer provided the case's most damning piece of evidence. Evelyn's silver Mercedes-Benz was pulled over for a minor infraction on a quiet street in the Upper East Side. When the officer asked to search the vehicle, Evelyn hesitated, her sudden nervousness piquing his interest. Inside the trunk, he discovered a silk scarf stained with blood. The scarf, elegant and monogrammed with Evelyn's initials, was a stark contrast to its grisly condition. It was immediately sent for forensic testing. The results came back within days. The blood was a match for Nathaniel Cross. This discovery solidified the connection between Evelyn and the crime scene. When detectives arrived at her penthouse with a warrant on the evening of March 20, she was visibly shaken. The once polished and composed socialite now seemed pale and disheveled, her confidence eroded by the weeks of scrutiny and growing evidence against her. The arrest was a spectacle. Photographers and reporters swarmed the streets outside her building, their camera flashes illuminating the grim scene as Evelyn was led away in handcuffs. The sight of one of Manhattan's most prominent socialites being escorted by officers sent shockwaves through the city. News channels interrupted regular programming to cover the story, branding it the scandal of the century. Inside the station, Evelyn sat quietly, her hands trembling as detectives read her the charges: second-degree murder. She offered no resistance but appeared emotionally distant, as if retreating into her thoughts. For those who had known her, it was a shocking transformation. A woman who had once been the center of attention at every gala now reduced to a figure of scandal and suspicion. As the investigation unfolded, further sordid details of Evelyn's relationship with Nathaniel began to surface. Former friends and acquaintances came forward, painting a picture of a woman consumed by obsession. Church staff whispered about the extravagant gifts she had lavished upon the Reverend, while members of the congregation recalled seeing her lingering after services, her gaze fixed on Nathaniel in a way that seemed far from spiritual devotion. By the time Evelyn's trial began, her reputation was in tatters. The revelations about her affair with Nathaniel, her increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to his murder captivated the nation. The public, once enamored with her glamour and charm, now debated her guilt in hushed tones over coffee and at dinner tables. For Evelyn, the life she had so carefully curated was now nothing more than a pile of ash. All that remained was the question of how deep her guilt truly ran. The investigation had taken just 2 weeks to unravel the truth. But the impact of the crime would reverberate for years. The once glittering world of Evelyn Monroe was now irrevocably stained by blood, betrayal, and tragedy. The trial of Evelyn Monroe began in June 2013. Drawing immense public attention as one of the most sensational cases in recent memory. Cameras lined the streets outside the courthouse, capturing every moment of Evelyn's arrival. Her once regal presence was now reduced to a shadow of its former self. Dressed in simple, muted clothing, she appeared somber and fatigued, far removed from the glamorous socialite who had once graced charity galas and high society events. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The prosecution and defense presented two vastly different narratives, each painting Evelyn in a starkly contrasting light. On one side was the image of a vulnerable woman trapped in a loveless marriage and manipulated by a charismatic pastor. On the other was the portrait of a dangerous woman consumed by obsession and driven to commit a crime of passion. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Margaret Reyes, wasted no time in laying out the case. Reyes was meticulous and unrelenting, presenting evidence that painted Evelyn as a woman whose fixation on Reverend Nathaniel Cross had spiraled out of control. Text messages between Evelyn and Nathaniel were read aloud, revealing her increasingly desperate attempts to maintain the affair. In one, she pleaded for his attention, while in another, her words were laced with anger and threats. These messages, coupled with handwritten love letters recovered from Nathaniel's apartment, created a vivid picture of Evelyn's emotional instability. Reyes also brought forward witnesses who testified to Evelyn's volatile behavior. Members of the church staff recounted heated confrontations between Evelyn and Nathaniel, describing moments when she had cornered him in his office, her voice raised in anger. One staff member, a secretary, recalled how Nathaniel had expressed concern over Evelyn's erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to his death, describing her as unpredictable and frightening. The forensic evidence was equally damning. The blood-stained scarf found in Evelyn's car was presented as a key piece of evidence, along with the high-heeled shoe left behind at the crime scene. The prosecution argued that these items, combined with the surveillance footage from Nathaniel's building, proved beyond a doubt that Evelyn had been at the apartment on the night of the murder. Reyes emphasized the brutality of the crime, describing how Nathaniel had been stabbed multiple times in what could only be described as a frenzied attack. The jury, visibly disturbed, listened intently as the details were laid bare. Evelyn's defense team, led by Richard Franklin, took a different approach. They painted her as a victim of her husband, her circumstances, and, most notably, of Nathaniel Cross. Franklin described Nathaniel as a manipulative man who used his position of power to prey on vulnerable women, including Evelyn. He argued that Nathaniel had lured Evelyn into an affair, exploiting her emotional fragility and loneliness for his own gratification. Franklin presented Evelyn as a woman drawn into a web of deceit, only to be discarded when she became inconvenient. To support their claims, the defense called upon a psychologist who testified that Evelyn exhibited signs of emotional dependency and psychological manipulation. Her behavior, they argued, was not that of a cold-blooded killer but of a woman pushed to the brink by a series of betrayals. They pointed to her troubled marriage, highlighting Richard Monroe's infidelity and emotional neglect as contributing factors to her mental state. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. The public was torn, with some sympathizing with Evelyn's plight while others condemned her actions as inexcusable. Friends of Nathaniel Cross filled the gallery, their grief evident as they listened to the details of his final moments. Meanwhile, Evelyn's family sat stoically, their support unwavering despite the weight of the accusations against her. When the jury was sent to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. After 3 days of intense discussion, they returned with a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. The announcement sent a ripple through the room. Evelyn, who had remained composed throughout much of the trial, appeared momentarily stunned. Her hands clasped tightly together as the verdict was read. Her expression one of quiet resignation, as though she had already prepared herself for this moment. The sentencing hearing, held later that month, was equally emotional. The judge sentenced Evelyn to 25 years to life in prison, citing the calculated nature of the crime and the devastating impact on Nathaniel's congregation and family. As the sentence was handed down, Evelyn sat motionless, her gaze fixed on an unseen point in the distance. For her, this was the end of a life she had once cherished, replaced by the stark reality of confinement and reflection. The trial revealed not only the dangerous power dynamics between Nathaniel Cross and his congregation but also the destructive consequences of unchecked emotions. It exposed the fragility of human relationships and the devastating lengths to which people could go when consumed by love, jealousy, and betrayal. In the aftermath, Evelyn became a symbol of caution, a reminder of how passion, when left unchecked, could lead to tragedy. Nathaniel's congregation struggled to move forward, their faith shaken by the revelations about their once revered pastor. For Evelyn, the walls of her prison became both her punishment and her refuge, a place where she would spend the rest of her days contemplating the choices that had led her to this point. Her story, forever etched in the annals of true crime, continues to serve as a haunting reminder of the thin line between love and obsession, and the devastating cost of crossing it.